is we'll just go ahead and undo the quick release skewer, which is this lever right in front. Now the way these are designed is safety wise, if this ever does open, your wheel's not coming out. So built into your forks, you have these two little safety tabs on the bottom, which stick out a little bit farther than your quick release lever. So that means, should this ever open while you're riding, you don't have to worry about the wheel rolling away from you. So in order for us to remove the wheel, we need to undo a little bit of the skewer. You don't need to unscrew it completely. The skewer does have springs on both sides. So you can see now they slowly start to push away equally from the fork, and then we can just slide it out. This one has a little bit wider tire, so you may need to just open up your brake lever. This little tab right here will actually just open up the pads enough that we can get the tire out, and then you can get ready to change it. So there's a couple of things. It ultimately just depends on where you are when you get the flat. A lot of times you can have the bike resting. Most of the time I'll recommend, if you don't have anyone there to hold it for you, to just lay it down. Because if it's already down, there's no probable situation where it may tip over and then you probably busted something. So let's say, hypothetically, this gets a flat.
So if you lay it down on the non-drive side.
Exactly. So you want to lay it down to where the gears are facing up.
Yeah.
And so the bike's not resting on your derailleur, so then when you put everything back on, now your shifting is kind of weird. So even at the shop, we have quite a few different tire levers. They all work equally well. The ones that we use are these Pedro ones. They're a little bit thicker, so you don't have to worry about them kind of bending and kind of making it a little bit more difficult for you. The main thing that I want to show you is this tire right here, which is probably what everybody's tire has, is what we call a clincher tire. So your tire actually has these two little beads that go all the way around, and they hook into the rim. And that's what keeps the tire from kind of coming off the rim while it's inflated. So in order for us to make it very easy for you, I'm actually going to push the bead towards the center of the rim, because your rim kind of goes a little bit smaller, a deeper section towards the center. So when we push those beads towards the center, you get a smaller circle, which means you get a lot more leverage, and it makes it easier to kind of maneuver the tire. So you don't need to be breaking levers or throwing your wheels off the side of the road.
So should you immediately let all the air out of the tire?
Yeah, so
already out?
Okay. If you have a slow leak where you know it's still maybe 20 or 30 psi, we already know it's going to be flat. It's just going to make it a lot easier in the long run just to let all the air out. So I'm going to move this tire from side to side, kind of keep it towards the center of the rim. And you can see slowly I'm getting a lot more leverage and a lot more tire. I'm able to maneuver it a little bit easier. There we go. So once we get to about this point where it just looks like it's kind of easy for you, we're going to take the tire lever. So this is going to be the easiest way. Don't use a flathead screwdriver. You want to try your hardest just to get the lip, this bead of the tire. A lot of times if you do find yourself struggling, you might have put it in a little too far. You're actually grabbing the tube, and now you're working against the tube. The tube wants to bring your lever back. So if we hook it in just right around this bead, you'll bring the lever over, and then I'll actually use my body weight so you're not trying to force your arm, and just push down, and that's going to bring it all the way around. So at that point you already have one side off, which is actually the only side that you need to take off. You don't need to remove the whole tire. What I'll do next is you can slowly just pull the tube out. And you can actually lift the tire over, bring out the valve, and you have your tube. If you have a smaller pump, or if you want to blow in the valve, you can at least examine to see where the puncture was caused, because obviously you want to make sure that it's not still in the tire, so when you put a new tube in, you get a flat right there. So sometimes we'll have a CO2 cartridge and a little pump that you can just pump up enough that you'll start to see a small leak or a hole if you don't find anything in the tire right from there. A lot of times down here, it's a really small piece of wire that actually goes in and sits flush with your tire, so you don't see it, but you'll feel it underneath. So the easiest way is if you do see that hole, I can put the valve back in and realign the tube, and it'll tell me exactly where on the tire it was. Which is why we don't take the tire off. Because now we know the tire hasn't moved, it hasn't rotated. Anytime we change out a flat, we always make sure that the words, one of the sides is right by the valve, so if you do slide it, you'll know which way to kind of orient it back. Because that'll just help you find out where the puncture was caused. So once you find that out, you can either feel under and see if the little wire, the thorn, or anything that caused the flat still in there. You can also use the tire lever and kind of scrape up and under, and sometimes you'll feel a little tick where it kind of grabs something, and then you can just pull that out. So the main thing is just making sure that the tire is clean, so then when we put that new tube back in, you don't have to worry about any punctures later on. So once we do this, let's pretend this is the good tube. Usually it's going to be rolled up in a little tiny ball tucked into your seat bag. It might have been there for a couple months, might have been there for 2 weeks. So we do want to make sure from time to time that you check it. Sometimes they will dry out. The tube is going to come rolled up. I would always recommend, whether you use your CO2, the little pump, or like I said, you can just blow into it. And you want to put a little bit of air, just enough that it holds its shape. Because if not, you will actually run a risk of, when you're putting the tube in, it'll twist. And then that'll just give you another puncture. So I use this pump to square it up a bit. That's all that needs to be, kind of just where it holds a shape. So in a sense, I'm going to do everything exactly in reverse. So you already have one side of the tire off. I'm going to lift the tire up on the side that we took off, up and over, and now I can see the valve. So the hole is right where I'm going to stick the valve, so we'll put that in, and then I can bring the tire back over. And now I can tuck the tire all the way in. So I'm doing this 2 ways, with both my hands. So with this hand, with my right hand, I'm actually pushing the tube up. And with the hand that's following, I'm making sure, and I can hold this up, that I'm tucking the tube in, onto the rim side. So I'm pushing it up, and then I'm kind of just, so you can see on this section, the tube's already sitting in the rim. It doesn't want to stay, it doesn't look like it's out here. This is going to make it a lot easier to put the other side of the tire back on. So we'll do this all the way around. And while you're looking at it, you can see that it's not twisting or anything, so it'll make it a lot easier to put it back on. So once we do this, if you do need to kind of move it a bit just to make sure your valve is straight, you can do so. Now, this is the bead. This, you can feel it's kind of a little bump right here on the edge of the tire. That's what's hooking into your rim. So we need to make sure that when you put it back on, that's seated correctly. Because if not, and you inflate it, this wants to jump out and you get a blowout. So I'll start from the valve and I'll push this in and down. And then you can see your tube's trying to come out a little bit here, so you can kind of just work it. The one thing we want to avoid is using the tire lever to put the tire back on. It's a lot easier to take it off because you already know the tube that's in there is already punctured. But you do run a risk, if it is too tight, you can actually pinch the tube, so you get your tire on and it's already flat. So you can see. So you'll end up working it to one side, and usually we'll end up with something like this, where it just becomes a little bit tougher. This is where everybody wants to easily go for that tire lever and just pop it back on. Easiest way to avoid that is, like I said, when we were taking it off, if we can push the bead that's already in towards the center of the rim, it's just going to give you a little bit more leverage and a little bit more tire to move over. So then I'm going to start on this side. Just makes everything more workable. And you see we're getting less and less.
You're not stretching it this way.
I'm pushing it in. I'm almost squeezing this towards the center of the
You're
rim.
not stretching it.
Exactly. There we go.
Well, that was easy.
Yeah.
For a continental.
Yeah.
I think
So-
that deserves it.
So at that point, we'll just put the little secure nut on here, and then you can go ahead and inflate it. Easiest way, another tool that we want to have is a CO2 cartridge. It fills the tire up with CO2, but it does it a lot faster than you having a little pump. You're going to be on the road for maybe 15 minutes trying to pump away, and it still wouldn't be able to get to the pressure that we need for you to make it home safely. Any of these CO2 cartridges and the inflators will take your tire from completely flat to about 120 psi in about 5 or 6 seconds. So you don't necessarily just want to leave it on there and let it rip until it stops, because you do need to make sure that your bead is seated correctly and everything's fine before you air it up to the pressure that you need to. So I'm actually going to use one of these. There's a couple of different types. This one has its own little carrier, and it also uses a trigger function. I have one that's a tiny bit smaller, and then you can thread the valve in. But this is the piece that you hold on to, and these are the pieces that you just buy replacements, so we'll have them at the shop. They're $3. You can go ahead and put this on. I always have the valve down, and I pull the inflator up. If it's down, you're more likely to run the risk of using your body weight, and you might bend the valve or damage something within the inflator.
You have to make sure the valve is open.
That's
Yes.
true.
Yeah, you do want to make sure. So with the Presta valve, it is going to have that little locking nut for the valve core, so we could just make sure that's open. We'll go ahead and put this in. So I'll have it just a little bit of pressure. And what I'm going to do is just check to make sure the bead all the way around the tire is seated correctly. Which is another thing that you can do is you can spin it, and it's pretty straight. You don't see any bumps, any hops, any wobbles. If it is kind of starting to come out, you can always release a little bit of the pressure. This is honestly about 10 to 12 psi. So you may be able to kind of work the bead in. If not, release a little bit of the CO2 and make sure it's seated correctly. Because if not, then when you do inflate this, it's going to be a louder, way louder bang than what happened to the cartridge.
I had that happen on my first tire exchange on my own, and it blew out the tube. So, and it does make a very loud bang.
So you can see the air wants to come out a little bit, and that's just because it's so cold that the rubber O-rings inside here kind of shrunk. So now it doesn't create that really good seal. But when you tighten it by hand, you can lock that in. I haven't seen any of them that have a pressure gauge. Usually what I'll do is I'll just compare it to the rear tire and get it as close to that feel as possible, because it's still going to be... One thing that you want to make sure is that your lever is on the non-drive side, so the side opposite of your gears. So we can go ahead and put this back on.
And if you're in doubt on that, look at your rear wheel, because that lever will be on that
You have
side.
the lever
Yeah.
on this side
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
So we can go ahead and kind of tighten this up just a bit. So the lever, I don't know if everybody can see it. So the lever right here is attached to the skewer that goes all the way through. And at the end, it's threaded. So you can, let me try to reach around this way. You can either hold this and just thread this on, or you can hold this and rotate that, whatever is easiest for you. But we do want to make sure it gets to a point where it starts to feel firm when you're tightening down the lever. So right there feels pretty good. And the main thing is I'll always hold the bike down. So for sure the forks are seated correctly within the dropouts, because if not, you'll tighten it down and it's rubbing the brakes, or it's just giving you a lot more of an issue, or it could definitely be unsafe to ride. So when I put that down, I'll push back, just make sure. You can press the brakes a couple of times and then spin the wheel. Nothing's rubbing. So we're good. And you do want to make sure that you re-engage your brake lever right there. So that'll just make it kind of stop how you used to. Just there we go. All right, so this is the one that everybody dreads. If you do get a flat on the back and no one is there to kind of hold the bike up, it's the same thing. I will recommend laying the bike on the floor already. I've seen it far too many times where you try to put the bike upside down and you take the wheel off. First, it's just confusing trying to put the wheel back on because now the bike's upside down. But sometimes the wind or anything will just tip the bike over and now your bike will get kind of dinged up or scratched or anything like that. So the easiest way to take the wheel off, and the first thing that I'm going to do is set it into the smallest gear, which is going to be your hardest gear. And what that's going to do is just leave us a mental note of where your chain was sitting before you took the wheel off. If you just take it off right now, you don't remember that it was on the 9th one, and you're going to try to put it back on one gear, and if the chain is seated on the next gear, it starts to shift the wheel, and it just becomes a lot more of a hassle trying to fit that wheel back on. So we can shift down in the front. You essentially want to go to the smallest gear and the smallest gear. So we can also disengage the brakes. It still has that same little lever right here, so we can open those up. Sometimes you may not need to do this. It all just depends on the width of your tire. With this skewer, you actually don't have the safety tabs like the ones on your fork. So when we release the skewer on this rear wheel, the wheel is just going to come out. So we can go ahead and open this up. And even when I pick up the bike, it already wants to kind of sit down. So we can go ahead and I'll pick up the bike and just roll the wheel out. So we can either have the wheel here. I'll set the bike up like this. It's already over, you don't have to worry about anything happening to it. And then we can go ahead and just do the same thing. So the exact same way, we'll, if there's still a little bit of pressure, we'll go ahead and release it. Make sure we're working that bead towards the center of the rim. And it's gonna make it a lot easier for you to get the tire lever in, around, and out. And then we'll be able to pull the tube out. Make sure you check the tube, make sure you check the tire, and then we can put that new tube in. You do, like I said, it makes it really helpful if you do inflate the tube just a bit. You don't have to worry about it twisting or kind of working itself in there and making a knot or anything like that. So to put this back on, let's pick the bike back up. And sometimes your chain will come off just a bit. You see right here, it kind of just came off the bottom. You can just make sure that you don't have any tension in the derailleur, so it's really easy for you to just put it back on. You don't have to do this after because it'll be a little bit more of a struggle. So the easiest way that I always recommend it is to, don't look at this part. So you see on your bike you have a top part of the chain and a bottom part of the chain. That's all we need to worry about. And you know that that top part of the chain was on your smallest gear. So I'm going to roll this in. And you can see right here, I have the top part of the chain on the top of that smallest gear. The bottom part of the chain is on the bottom of the gear. And we can just roll the wheel back on. And it'll just sit back down.
Yeah.
It makes it a lot harder when the chain is on a certain gear, if the bike is upside down, if the chain is actually on the big gear, it wants to pull this thing around a lot when you're trying to bring it back in. So when you have it in the small gear and small gear, it just gives you a lot less tension in the chain, makes it a lot more workable to get that wheel back on. So you can see I can easily, if we need to lift this off, here it's just the brakes that are kind of getting in the way. So it just rolls out, we'll roll it in. I can even see from here that the chain is on that top part. And we also have chain on the bottom, so we can just roll it back in. Ooh. This will save you probably about half an hour on the side of the
Yeah, a lot of time.
So if you aren't working the skewer too much, when you put this wheel back on, you can simply just close it. Because it didn't need to be adjusted, you didn't need to unthread the little cap like on the front one. So we can close it, we'll spin the wheel, make sure everything's shifting correctly. Brakes aren't rubbing, we can make sure we re-engage that brake caliper. And you're all set.
Voila.